the Melbourne Storm Football Club has decided to dramatically scale back the use of welcome to country and presumably acknowledgement of country ceremonies. This, of course, has triggered consternation from the usual parties, but has triggered approval from many more, with the overall reaction being approving. And indeed, Melbourne Storm hadn't been using many welcome to the country ceremonies throughout 2024, seemingly already scaling it back, but now just making it official and confirming that with the media. Now, the Melbourne Storm has indicated they'll still use welcome to country ceremonies at some major events. For example, in the Indigenous round, they will still use it. They'll just use it less than they had before. Now, in terms of welcome to country ceremonies, they have of course become a little bit divisive, similarly with acknowledgement of country ceremonies, perhaps even more so with acknowledgement of country ceremonies, because they involve an imposition and perhaps a form of coerced speech. People being told to do an acknowledgement of country when they're just being informed and forced to do so. Nevertheless, some people do like both of those ceremonies. Many others don't particularly like them, regarding them as lecturing or haranguing, or feeling as if they are being welcomed to their own country, or talked down to, or some others might feel it's the first step toward broader policy changes or other concessions. For example, if we do a welcome to country or an acknowledgement of country, will we start changing place names next? We've already seen some signs that might be occurring. There's already been reports that SBS has been using Indigenous names in some of its weather maps. Now, of course, that looks innocuous, but all of these things start to build up. And for example, if we are renaming Sydney or Brisbane or Melbourne, well, how exactly would we decide the relative contribution of Indigenous people who were there beforehand versus the people who built various buildings in Sydney or Melbourne or Brisbane, etc.? How do we actually decide what the name should be? Regardless, that's a bit of a digression. It might also embolden demands for other additional tithes, so expenditures of money, or other additional Indigenous approval bodies. After all, when everyone has a welcome to country, it's a tacit acknowledgement that you need to be welcome to the country, and therefore it would seem to imply you would also need Indigenous approval for various other things. Now, of course, others still note that welcome to country ceremonies can be rather expensive. After all, you need to pay someone to perform these welcome to country ceremonies. And it can't just be anyone, it has to be a specific body, people from that specific area. It almost is a relatively concentrated monopolistic type practice. And one might wonder whether that money could be better deployed elsewhere, whether it's on corporate profits which can be distributed back to shareholders, or on other services, or a combination of both. Now, this latter aspect, involving money, might be one of the reasons that drove the Melbourne Storm's decision. Although I dare say the Melbourne Storm might be thinking that if they've got more welcome to country ceremonies, are they going to start emboldening more demands? And they might be wanting to head that off. Or maybe we're just reading too much into it, and they just decided to restructure what they were doing. Regardless, it has been a significant change, and we can think of several reasons for why they might have done this change. Now, of course, Melbourne Storm is not going to come out and say exactly why they did it, at least in so many words. Rather, Melbourne Storm is going to use the usual marketing speak to make it sound as if they are doing a service to everyone involved. So to that end, the Melbourne Storm came out with a statement in relation to welcome country ceremonies. In this statement, Melbourne Storm essentially said they were not abandoning welcome to country ceremonies. Rather, they were just recalibrating them, using them at major important events, potentially trying to enhance the symbolism and meaningfulness of welcome to country ceremonies by emphasizing them in specific areas. Melbourne Storm also indicated they were more about actions than words, and were going to do other various things, which weren't entirely clear, to help Indigenous Australians. Clearly, Melbourne Storm felt as if they needed to placate people that were upset about their decision. Now, in terms of welcome to country and acknowledgement of country ceremonies, I have said in the past that I'm not exactly a fan of these. After all, during the Voice referendum, when people threatened to not do a welcome to country or acknowledgement of country ever again if people voted no, it was a bit of a relief for many people. Now, I personally have never actually had to do an acknowledgement of country ceremony or an acknowledgement of country statement. I've managed to studiously avoid having to do so. However, if I were to have to do so, I would obviously find ways to at least lessen the psychological blow of coerced speech. For example, I would also acknowledge everyone for every country that is in the room. After all, whether someone immigrated to Australia, was born in Australia, has Indigenous heritage or not, one might wonder that all people might deserve to be acknowledged and welcomed into that particular environment. I would also thank the soldiers, so the Australian Defence Force, for protecting Australia. It starts to become a little bit more diluted and a little bit more nebulous because we are thanking everyone. A strategy I would not take is the strategy taken by some of our politicians, which is to do an acknowledgement of country ceremony even while overseas, which seems a little bit ridiculous to be acknowledging Indigenous Australians when you're in another country that presumably has its own Indigenous population. And it would appear, in fact, to be a little bit disrespectful to the Indigenous population of that specific location and of that country to be forcing our statements onto that country and to be acknowledging implicitly Indigenous Australians in that country. It doesn't make a ton of sense. Welcome to country ceremonies can, of course, be interesting to look at. Rather, it is the implication behind it that has more of a problem. The implication behind it is that we do need to be welcome to the country, and by implication, that there must be further concessions or further acknowledgements, or one must seek permission to do various things, such as seeking permission to go into various national parks, or to go into various beaches, or as the voice would have it, permission to do various activities, because the voice body would implicitly have had the ability to be consulted, and in fact the right to be consulted on many activities. Or if we were to look at the heritage laws in Western Australia, they to some extent appear to be symptomatic of the ethos behind a welcome to the country. So Melbourne Storm made the right call, and sending a signal the Melbourne Storm isn't going to be coerced and forced into doing these ceremonies. It's about establishing a degree of autonomy and an ability to push back against people that are forcing you or requiring you to do so. It's about sending a signal, and seeing that signal is valuable. They've established a clear line as to when and what they are willing to do. And that shows a degree of self-respect as an organization, and it pushes back against ever more demands. I think, therefore, it was actually quite a smart decision to push back in this manner. But let me know your thoughts about whether the Melbourne Storm is right or whether they're wrong, whether they should have any welcome to countries or scale it back and maybe have it, but have it on their terms. Now, of course, Melbourne Storm is just one organization. We've all been to business meetings or shows or events where there's been a welcome to country ceremony, even though it's not entirely clear why. It might be a perfunctory business event, but one has this type of ceremony, seemingly because the person organizing it wanted to perhaps demonstrate that they were part of the right crowd. And the people who are doing that welcome to country ceremony obviously are charging money, ramping up the cost for anyone who's going out and buying tickets, for example. So should other organizations follow the approach of Melbourne Storm? Or should they abandon welcome to countries entirely? Or have them only at major events? Let me know what you think.